Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now today, I want to talk about how a sweeping digital transformation approach often creates a chasm of accountability, where those who develop the ambitious digital strategy are neither responsible for, nor do they understand the complexity involved in the nuts and bolts and execution of it all. So that approach almost feels like climbing a set of stairs where you don't just jump the entire distance between the first floor and the second. You actually take a series of smaller steps between floors and gradually climb upstairs in stages. And one thing that we're learning now, I think, is that there is no finish line for businesses to cross when it comes to digital or digital transformation journeys. As new technologies are introduced, business conditions are always going to change, competitors are going to catch up, and eventually, you guessed it, a new digital state is required. So today, I've invited Justin Maracucci from a company called Endava onto the podcast to discuss this topic in more detail, which means, yes, it's time for me to ask you all to buckle up and hold on tight, because I'm going to beam your ears all the way to New Jersey, where Justin is waiting to speak with us today. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, Neil, thanks. So my name's Justin Maracucci. I'm Endava's Chief Digital Officer. I'm responsible for helping to set the digital direction of the clients that we work with as an organization. And I look after a big chunk of Endava in general. We're a global next-gen technology services company. We're about 10,000 people globally. And we do distributed enterprise agile at scale, really helping the organizations that we work with grasp the future. So evolve their business models and change the way they approach technology in general by taking a look at how do they define product and technology strategies, or design and build intelligent digital experiences, or deliver world-class engineering. We really work with our organizations and help them along that journey. And frankly, we have a hell of a fun time doing it.
Love that. And before we talk about Endava, I've got to ask, what's your origin story? Where did your passion for technology come from? And what was it that lit that spark that would ultimately put you on this path you're on today?
Yeah, so it's probably different than a lot of the other folks in my position. So I actually have an art background. Yeah. And so I got a fine arts degree from a liberal arts college in 2000, so right at the turn of the millennium. And realized right at the end of that while I was an outstanding illustrator, I had really no marketable skill. And so I learned how to program, because that was right at the .com era. And I started doing really early web design, super, super early. And at that point in time, user experience wasn't a thing. Nobody had coined the phrase yet. It was just all of the things that you had to do to make something that was useful and usable and that people appreciated. And so I worked for a number of organizations, Sony Electronics and AT&T, as I grew up. And I realized that the way that people were going about those sorts of things just could be improved. And we weren't putting the right kind of emphasis on what the user actually had to go through to achieve the goal that they had. So I ended up starting my own shop, which I ran until about 2015. So I put about 13 years into that. And then we were acquired in 2015 by Endava, as Endava was this outstanding engineering firm that really had this goal of building a future for clients. And my group and myself, we focused on always putting the user first. And I think my passion for technology is really derived from my appreciation of the user's concerns and how you can achieve amazing things with technology, but they're pointless unless they're usable and delightful and have more function than form in some cases. But my passion has always been about how do you put teams together of creative people and product people and engineers and data scientists to solve like really complex business problems, utilizing technology in a way that is delightful for those individuals that have to use that technology as humans.
What a great story. And I love how that path led you to Endava. And that's one of the reasons I invited you on the podcast today, is because you're actually reimagining the relationship between people and technology. And that's something that this show stands for too. So can you expand on how you're doing that and the kind of problems that you're solving for your customers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think whether it's in a customer sense or a B2B sense, the user has to be at the center of every technology decision that is made today. I think one of the big issues that a lot of organizations have, and that I've seen, again, both in the professional capacity in Endava as well as just being a consumer, is that the goal of technology can't be usage, right? That's just the wrong way to think about it. And so often we're in conversations where companies are touting how much usage their apps or their systems get. And it's just the wrong approach. The goal of technology is whatever the user is trying to achieve, whether that's like paying a bill or customizing a product experience or moving goods from like A to B with a fraction of the effort required. That's how you have to think about the goal. And that's the point of technology. So users need to get more out of the technology experiences that we make them go through than energy they invest into those. And I think the zenith of technology experiences, and really what we're shooting for and how we're changing that relationship, is creating a series of experiences that achieve that goal, that whatever that user set out to achieve, without them having to really intervene at all in that technology experience. So having the contextual intelligence or the automation or whatever it ends up being that achieves that goal with zero effort required. That's what we're shooting for. Now we're not there, but surely we're getting substantially closer. And so that's really what we look to provide to our clients, right? Better, effortless relationships with their customers that allow their businesses to grow and thrive in the new digital world by very specifically taking better care of that customer experience. And that can get illustrated in two completely different ways with completely different levels of kind of gravity and importance. But on one hand, it could be something like we do a huge amount of work in the payment space, and we work for one of the global payments giants, and we're working with them to build out real-time payment infrastructures that allow population centers in countries that either have taxed or underdeveloped traditional infrastructures to be able to transact via entirely digital commerce pathways, whether that's mobile or otherwise. And the benefit to individuals and to people and to societies, it creates huge socioeconomic upside and flexibility for both those customers that previously wouldn't be able to interact in that way, or to the businesses that they rely upon to provide those services. Really meaningful and absolutely changes the relationship people have with technology. And on the other hand, it could be something as simple as we have a relationship and work with Citizen Watches, and we worked with them to solve what ended up being a nagging business problem, but actually really could yield some real results. And when people buy watches, you get that kind of really awkwardly shaped, thick black book that comes in the square watch box that has the instructions and the warranty. Nobody ever reads that. And as a result, nobody ever fills out the registers for the warranty for their watch. And so we worked with Citizen to create an application that intelligently was able to identify the watch that somebody had just bought by just taking a picture of it, and then it auto-registered the warranty information for that individual. And so for the individual, it provides them the ability to achieve something of warranty, which gives them peace of mind from a financial standpoint down the road, plus easier access to instructions and that sort of thing. Was something they wouldn't have done previously. And to Citizen, it both creates a cost savings in not having to print those awkwardly shaped instruction manuals and warranty books that nobody looks at, as well as then gives them the ability to engage on an ongoing basis with that customer. And so those are, again, two very different examples, but in both cases, it's fundamentally looking at how do we improve the relationship that the individual and at the end state has with that technology, and how do we enable those organizations to do so more.
I must admit, I'm a guy that never opens them awkwardly shaped instruction manuals.
Oh, no, yeah. They get thrown right in the trash can immediately.
Yeah, 100%, man. And another reason I invited on the podcast, I had a great line from you guys where you said a sweeping digital transformation approach often actually creates a chasm of accountability. I love that line, where those who develop the ambitious digital strategy are neither responsible for nor do they understand the complexity involved in the nuts and bolts and the execution of it all. So I'm curious, from everything that you've seen out there and the conversations you're having with your clients, can you bring that to life by possibly sharing some of the things that you've seen?
Yeah, I think it comes back to the notion of how you approach digital change in itself. Those chasms of accountability, or chasms, depending upon where you were born, of accountability they're really based upon how an organization approaches these big digital efforts, right? So when you silo the thinking and the strategy of how you're going to approach digitization, and then silo the product design component of that, and then approach the technology afterwards, you've created these gaps, these chasms, if you will, in the accountability between making those decisions about what should be built, why it's going to work, and how you're going to go about doing it, to then executing it and learning from it. And what it creates, these like accountability hot potato sessions between strategy consultants who came up with the idea and then the IT groups that have to implement it, about who screwed up the transformation and why things aren't working the way they should. And that's because people have, taken the approach of serially moving through kind of that strategy, design, and technology things. That's all avoidable. People lose time, they waste money, and most importantly, you lose the appetite and the inertia of the organization to the excitement for the change that you're going to try and put in place. And so the way that you avoid all of that is you need to build and empower these cross-functional teams that are comprised of strategists and product folks and designers and engineers and architects and DevOps folks that are responsible for owning and designing that digital change, provided that the general business problem has been established. And those teams then give the organization the flexibility and the agility to move at pace, because you're solving all of those problems, strategy, product, technology, in small, nimble teams as you go. You're taking smaller steps to do that. So not only does that mean all of your decisions are triangulated into a way where they're going to be more battle hardened because you're approaching them from so many different angles. But it does mean then when you do have to make a change, and when you do, some market condition has been tweaked in one way or the other, you can do so and understand the implication across all of those different kind of capabilities and disciplines at the same time. And that change has a higher probability of being. And so for all of those reasons, we have just seen too many instances of those accountability gaps over time. And so it forced us to think about doing things years and years ago, about doing things a little bit differently to bridge those gaps and create a far more seamless experience.
And I think the events of the last 2 years have taught every business leader that digital transformation is a journey, not a destination. And there is no finish line for a business to cross when it comes to digital. And especially as new technologies are introduced, business conditions change, competitors catch up, and eventually a new digital state is once again required. So can you expand on how to approach a challenge like that? Because I think it's something that will affect every business in every industry.
Yeah. So it's funny. You one of your previous podcasts, you talked to Rich Nanda from Deloitte, and he talked about that specifically as well, right? That there's no end to digital. And I honestly, I couldn't agree more. That unfortunately, the word transformation is a misnomer, I think, in and of itself, because it, by virtue of transformation, you're starting in one state and finishing in another state. And there's a distinct start and end state to that process. And that's a misnomer, because digital necessitates this continuous embracing of change and evolution. And we have jumped on that. And we talk about, instead of digital transformation, we talk about digital acceleration as really a much better way to put a name on what we're trying to do. Because it is about not only changing an organization, but it's about embracing and speeding up the appetite and the pace of that change in a way that doesn't have any desired end state, because things are changing so much. And so it's about really defining a desired business outcome up front that is, again, loose. It's understood, but it's loose. And then working through it in rapid iterative design and development cycles, where as you're testing, as you're building, you're gathering data, you're putting things in the hands of consumers as early as possible. You're learning about what works and what doesn't work. And then you're making incremental adjustments to that approach to account for those changes in customer behavior or the market or user expectation. And those incremental steps actually are what create the instances of positive achievement, of little wins, of little goals, of little improvement that then continually fuel the positivity and the energy of the organization in seeing that this process is working. But it's the little steps that are important, because it's, an analogy that works is it's like standing on the first floor of a building, knowing you need to get to the second floor, looking up at it for 20 minutes, mustering your strength, and then trying to jump it in one leap. Like that doesn't work, right? The easiest way to get from floor 1 to floor 2 is taking a series of small, manageable steps and achieving that goal in less time, but frankly, a far higher success probability, because you're doing it in understood increments. And so that's how we approach achieving a company's business goals with technology. And frankly, that's digital acceleration.
And just to bring to life everything that you've just talked about there, do you have any client stories that you could share of how you've helped a customer break down digital change into those small, discrete efforts, and also how embracing a culture of continuous change and improvement by using data to fuel that digital future and putting the user at the centre of the decision making? I appreciate you might not be able to mention any particular names, but if there is any use cases that spring to mind that will just help people understand how it could work in their world.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I apologize for having to obfuscate names. Our business is about making our clients successful, and we ferociously support that. We have a large European bank that we work with, and they needed to optimize big chunks of their operations. And so in conversations with them, we started to look at just an area where they were uncomfortable, which was really in their loans division. So they had a big paralegal team that was working through the kind of onboarding and monthly assessment of issued loans. And it was a very manual process. It had an enormous amount of paper, like physical paper involved in it. And it was costly and probably not as efficient as it could be. And so we worked with them in building this kernel of an idea, which could we digitize that paper to digital process and create a platform that kind of automated the ingestion of that material. And then, could we do interesting things with that once it was ingested? And following digital acceleration was about taking it in very small steps. And so the first POC we built was functioning technology. It was we trained up a machine learning based system and a neural network to understand how to ingest really complex and dense legal documents and identify during that ingestion all of the covenants that were listed in those documents. And so these are effectively the terms of the loan, and validate that they understood. And then from there, there's a huge amount of material that gets sent in by the borrowers in those instances to validate that the terms of those covenants are in good standing. So whether that's other account statements or whatever. And so we're ingesting all of these different materials. We're validating the covenants that are there. We're validating that they're not in a breach state. And then in doing, we're able to more effectively manage and support the organization. And we built a POC where we got that technology working early on, and we used a combination of Stanford's NLP libraries, as well as had to build a bunch of our own, just because legalese is hard for humans to read, let alone trying to teach a computer to do. And then from there, we validated that we were able to increase the efficiency of the ingestion after only a couple of weeks. We were able to increase the accuracy of the reporting and the identification of covenants. And at that point, the client was super thrilled. They're like, hey, this is exactly what we wanted. We improved their operations because we were able to take a big chunk of that paralegal team that was working on doing that manual effort. And then they were able to focus them on far more important and useful activities within the bank. Where the benefit of approaching these sorts of engagements in a series of small incremental steps is you learn so much through the process. And the data that we started to get from the systems as we built them was all of a sudden we had this previously all of these unstructured data in these loan documents that were now very structured. And we understood the covenants that were in breach more often. And so we were able to then apply some really smart data science to understand what the behavior of the users or the borrowers that led to these breach events based upon the information that they were sending in. And we were able to then start to do some trend analysis to create flags within that whole loan process to better administer those accounts and reach out proactively to those borrowers prior to what would likely be a breach scenario to avoid it, which creates huge savings to the organization. And I think additionally, at the same time, based upon all of that additional data, the organization and the bank was able to understand those covenants that frankly could be written better to avoid breach scenarios, which create, again, better relationships with their customers, as well as create more efficiency for their organization. Now, we didn't intend to do those things early on. That wasn't in the brief, but those were the things because the way that we had built the teams, the way that we partnered with the bank, we empowered the teams to think about all of the possible upside as this new information came in, and taking a lot of incremental steps and building something that went from this tiny kernel of a POC into something that is, deployed in production at scale, created massive downstream benefit for the organization outside of the remit of the initial just improve our operation. We wouldn't have achieved that if we had overwrought the requirements up front in a waterfall capacity. You would have missed all of that because that wouldn't have been what you were driving towards. And so in that instance, digital acceleration proves to be far more valuable for an organization because you've achieved far more than you thought you were going to initially.
And the message I'm getting from you there is that businesses today should have processes in place to constantly improve their digital properties, and they must also constantly re-examine, update and iterate on them, or risk finding themselves left behind faster, especially as more digital savvy competitors gather ground on them, or even worse, they could even make them extinct. But with all that in mind, what advice would you offer to a business leader that could be listening to our conversation today, anywhere in the world, and thinking about acting after listening to this podcast? What advice would you offer?
Yeah, so I think there's a handful of points. And the way that I try to break down this conversation when I have with clients is, one, I think everybody has to recognize that all businesses are not starting from scratch with digital. And I think there ends up being a really easy kind of red meat approach by a lot of organizations to try and get a company to think that they're starting over, you're starting from scratch. And that's not the case. Organizations for the last 20 years have invested in their digital infrastructures and products. We just have to do a better job of understanding how they need to evolve. And that starts by breaking down the digital change that we need to put in place into smaller, discrete efforts. Organizations need to embrace a culture of continuous change and ongoing iterative improvement. And that's not just in how we think about putting new features in place, but it's also how you actually implement a DevOps oriented mindset into how you're building technology and you're deploying technology and how you're operating it in the future. We need to ensure, and most organizations are really starting to do this, which is encouraging, but we need to be basing the path that we take from a digital standpoint on data that we're getting from our existing systems. And so if your existing products and services are not resulting in huge amounts of data around user behavior and transactional behavior and all of those sorts of things, then you're guessing about what you need to do in the future. So the first things first, understand what's actually happening, even if it's going to be painful to recognize, but you have to have data at the root of those decisions. And then again, the overarching one that speaks to my background is put the user at the center of all of your decision making. And again, more and more organizations are starting to say that, which is so encouraging. But if the first reason why you're doing something is a business oriented decision, then the likelihood of it being successful is going to be tenuous because it may not be sustainable. Put the user at the center of that decision making and have the user benefit be the first way and the first defense of why you're doing something. And a lot of it, you'll have a far better chance of having a successful outcome downstream.
And what about yourself and indeed Endava? What's going to be your big focus this year? Is there anything you can share around that?
I mean, for me and for the organization, it's going to be continue to defend the user, right? Like I think Tron said it best. We need to ensure that the technology experiences that we design and build for our clients are responsibly designed and they're sustainably built to solve business problems. And it takes a little extra effort to make sure that what we build from a technology standpoint is going to help not just solve a business problem, help customers and make our clients happy and more successful, but how do we help to improve the world around us, like social and economic inclusion or environmentally friendly and climate responsible technology? Those things, we can deliver those as we define the digital future. And I believe that we all as technologists, need to take up the personal, and speaking for Endava, the corporate responsibility to do so, because the impact of the change in the technologies that we put in place now is so much more acute than it was at any other previous time. If you think about the time it takes technology to reach 50 million users, right? It took the airplane 68 years for them to get to 50 million users. It took the radio 38, the mobile phone 12 years. So there had previously been such a huge amount of time until new technologies and new approaches were at scale that we fundamentally had an opportunity to adjust things if in fact we saw that it was going to create bad social behavioral issues or climate issues. And it took Angry Birds 35 days to get to 50 million users. And it took Pokemon Go 19 days to get to 50 million users. So that the amount of time we have to appropriately tweak and adjust technology as it gets out there, since a lot of technology advancement right now is happening in the software space, is enabled by software as opposed to enabled by manufacturing. We have to be more responsible and approach the responsibility of that new technology in a way that I think our industry has not done in the past with as much support as needed. And so that's our focus this year, is creating that sort of responsibility and delivering that while defending the users on their journey with technology.
And we've talked a lot about the challenges facing businesses at the moment, but what excites you about the future and how you're going to continuously see the space evolving?
And I think that's it, right? There's no slowdown in sight, right? So what's exciting is that this pace of change is going to continue to accelerate. And you think then about the necessity of change, particularly as it relates to new technologies coming to bear. Like, we're so close to the quantum age and achieving quantum supremacy right now. And when we do, so much about what we believe is possible with computing is going to get completely flipped on its head. And so that's an instance where we thought the impact of mobile phones was enormous, or we thought the impact of flexible architectures and data interoperability was impactful. When all of a sudden we're able to start simulating incredibly complex environments and systems and weather patterns and generating kind of probabilistic approaches to things, it fundamentally will change so many of the industries that we currently rely on as humanity. That's inordinately exciting. It scares the bejesus out of me at the same time, but that's why we have to approach it with the understanding that we have to be responsible.
And we started the podcast today on your origin story. As we come full circle, and I like to have a bit of fun with you, and I'm going to ask you if there was a song, piece of music, movie, book, or an individual that has inspired you or helped you in your career. What would you choose and why? And what would you leave with our listeners today? Is there anything that springs to mind?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. So it's very right brain, left brain for me, particularly early in my career when I was both an active designer doing artwork for digital interfaces, as well as then running and building a business. So I was writing proposals and that sort of thing. So anytime I was designing for probably a period of 4 years, I would put Coheed and Cambria's Welcome Home off of their Good Apollo album on repeat in a pair of headphones. And I would listen to it for like 6 hours or 8 hours straight, just because it had this chugging pace to the song, and it continually kept your adrenaline flowing, particularly as I was designing late into the evening or early into the morning. But that one is amazing. The Coheed and Cambria is fantastic. But at the same time, if I had to do something, if I had to write a proposal or something that required words, I ended up listening to classical music, and specifically Beethoven's Symphony No. 7 in A major, for no other reason than it was the first one in the classical playlist on my iPhone. But those two pieces of music, if I hear them now, I completely get thrown back into kind of the heady days of building things and getting in a position to be a part of Endava. But they're wonderful pieces of music.
They really are. I love how music can transport you back like that. So I'll add both of those to our Spotify playlist. But before I let you go, for anyone wanting to find out more information about Endava or contact you or your team, what's the best starting point?
Yeah, so we're on the web at endava.com, endava.com. We're also on Instagram and Twitter, LinkedIn, at Endava. And then the same thing for myself, at Justin Marcucci, across all the major platforms. Good luck with the spelling. I'll let everybody figure it out themselves.
Love that. And I love chatting with you today about how companies can accelerate digital by recognising they're not starting from scratch, but break it down and break digital change into those smaller, discrete efforts. So much value that you've offered today. And more than anything, thank you for sharing your story as well. It's incredible. And leaving us with 2 great tunes. But thanks for sitting down and sharing that with me today.
Yeah, Neil, thanks for having me. It's been a blast. Appreciate it.
The big takeaway for me there was that companies can best accelerate digital by just recognising that they're not starting from scratch and breaking down digital change into small, discrete efforts, and embracing a culture of continuous change and an ongoing iterative improvement, using data to fuel their digital future and putting the user at the centre of their decision making. Because businesses today are challenged with having the right processes in place to constantly improve their digital properties. And to do that, they're going to need to constantly re-examine, update and iterate on them, or risk finding themselves left behind more digital savvy competitors, or even worse, extinct. But that was my takeaway. What was yours? Simply email me now, techblogwriter@outlook.com. Pop by my website, techblogwriter.co.uk. Send me your messages and questions and pictures to come on the podcast and join me, and we'll keep this conversation going. But right now, it's time for me to walk off into the fake sunset. So a big thank you for choosing to listen to this podcast. I do realise that sending a different episode every day runs a risk of clogging up your feed, so I appreciate you all more than you know. So thank you for listening, and until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.